Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 10, where we really look at kind of the more contemporary issues around hazards and apocalypses. And so maybe we could call this module, let's see, The Trouble We're In. That's what I put it on the PowerPoint. How about Apocalypse Now? Oh, has that already been taken? All right. Well, we'll just go with The Trouble We're In. So, coming to you now from summer of 2021. And as most of you are aware, the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States has been kind of on the wane, but there's some economic concerns on the horizons and a whole lot of political instability still going on, and conspiracy theories and all sorts of things that also tie back to the end of the world. So let's just dig in here, because there's actually quite a bit of information in this module, but hopefully what it does is it kind of takes the things we've looked at all course long and try to apply it to kind of thinking about some of the contemporary problems we have, not just in terms of natural hazards, which is what we've looked at a lot, but also the way they really interact with human societies, and also some of the kind of human-caused hazards that we have to deal with too, like economic instability, political instability, and so on. All right, so let me get to where it will let me click. There we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about pandemics and diseases as apocalypses. We'll talk a little bit about the prospect of economic collapse as a sort of end of world of sorts, and also the political attraction of apocalypse in turbulent times. So to start off with, let's talk about disease as apocalypse. This one's, of course, pretty easy to sort of wrap our heads around because we are, in the United States, we are in this position now where, vaccines have rolled out, things are kind of opening up again, we're not wearing masks much anymore, that kind of thing, and the cases are definitely waning. However, that is not true when you look at most of the world, right? If you actually look at the number of cases, there's been more cases in 2021 in the world of COVID than there was in 2020. And so, for instance, this is taken from about a week before I started recording this, showing the cumulative number of cases of COVID-19 in the world. And you can see that we are here at 178 million. We have about 3.8 million deaths attributed to COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic. And if you go back just a year, this year, 3.8 million deaths cumulatively. About 1 year ago, we were looking at less than 500,000 deaths, right? So a lot has gone on in the last year, and it continues to be pretty bad in many parts of the world. But one of the things that I want to do here is to kind of put some of the stuff around COVID-19 in kind of longer historical perspective. And this is a little bit of an older visual, but I like it because it shows kind of the history of different kinds of diseases and the death tolls, and also kind of how frequently we see these kinds of pandemics. I think, many people were somewhat surprised by COVID-19. I think there was, generally speaking, a feeling that we're kind of done with this sort of thing. But as you probably noticed from this course, people tend to think that a lot about a lot of things. So, for instance, are we going to see another large tsunami on the coast of Japan that could knock out our nuclear power plants? People are like, maybe we're past that thing. Obviously, we're not past that thing. When we look at space hazards, asteroids and things have hit the Earth, coronal mass ejections have hit the Earth, and they will again, right? But things that tend to happen on timescales of hundreds of years, people tend to not necessarily consider those risks very much, or they tend to think that somehow those risks are not going to hit them. And as we've seen, no, we do get hit by those. So if we look at this kind of history of disease here, you can see, here this is COVID, but this is from last year. So remember, we have that new data of 4.5 million, which size-wise would actually put it up here, between some of the larger plagues like the 17th century Great Plagues and the Antonine Plague. I confess I don't know what that one was all about. And you can also see some of the, kind of the frequency at which these large plagues hit. I have another visual here that kind of puts them into more of a time scale, chronology with the sizes, based on the number of deaths. And again, this is old data for COVID, right? COVID would actually be quite a bit larger now with about 4 plus million, fatalities. But you can see that, yeah, these things happen pretty regularly, right? It's actually would be pretty unusual to go 100 years without something hitting us like this. And of course, the world is much more interconnected in a quicker way because of globalization than we have been in the past. And so, the Spanish flu, that hit in 1918, 1919 was really also, a time period of intense, kind of globalization post World War I or during World War I and immediately after that. But people didn't move around quite to the same extent. Air travel was not very common, that sort of thing. And so it took a couple of years for the Spanish flu to sort of make it all around the world. COVID went all around the world very, very quickly, right? And of course, there's been a ton of maps. And one of the things that I put in this module is sort of how did the disease kind of get out of China in the first place, from Wuhan and then to the surrounding areas. And it's a very interesting visualization kind of showing, not just how diseases move, but it kind of shows how people move, right? And how quickly. And also, it's probably a good thing to kind of consider that when we're thinking about future pandemics and that sort of thing, people move and the diseases we carry move. And oftentimes before we can really trace what's going on. And so, as has been sort of shown, for the vast majority of countries in the world, border closures and trying to stop travel was not enough to keep the virus out. And, one of the things that folks have talked about in terms of, how these diseases spread is there's this term called R0, the little zeros and naught. And, different diseases have different R0s. And what it basically means is how many people if some person's infected, how many people on average do they infect? And with COVID, it's about 2.5, right? It depends on the context. Reason why we also do things like put masks on or, socially distance these past years is that lowers the R0. It means that you're not going to infect as many people and you slow the spread of the disease through the population. But also just the nature of the different viruses or illnesses themselves, some of them spread much more easily than others. Like, for instance, you'll notice measles down here. Measles is brutal. It is incredibly infectious. If you have an unvaccinated population of people who are not vaccinated for measles, the R0 for measles is like 17. And so you're going to, for every one person who gets infected, they're going to infect 17 other people. And you can see how that would then spread like wildfire through any non-vaccinated population. Smallpox was similarly much more infectious, rubella, other things like that. But COVID, thankfully, is about as infectious as influenza. But as you can see, even an R0 of around 2 to 3 is still enough to really be transmitted pretty much everywhere. Anything that has an R0 greater than 1 has the ability to keep moving and in a sort of exponential way through a population as more and more people get infected. And so one of the whole reasons for the vaccinations is that if you surround that person that has, the virus with people that are unable to contract it or at least are very resistant to contracting it, then it cuts down on that R0 and eventually, the disease itself kind of peters out, which is one of the things we've seen to a large degree in the United States as of June of 2021. Right, and so that's one of the reasons why vaccines help, and the fact that the vaccines have been quite successful when you look at the percentages of stopping the transmission. And so because of that, it's just that the virus is hitting more dead ends and not transmitting as far. However, as we've seen, there's also new variants that are more infectious and also a little more dangerous to human health. And so the early indications is that the vaccines are effective against most all of the new mutations. But, so far. Okay, but one thing that we should think about here is thinking about, disease and also kind of movement and globalization that goes on, around the world. COVID is a great example of kind of how globalization can affect disease, right, and disease transmission and, its movement around the pandemic. But also, COVID has been a very interesting way of looking at kind of being able to see just how interconnected the global economy usually is. Because one of the things that has happened with COVID is that a lot of the, interconnections around the world have been severed in different ways, right? As of this recording, the US-Canadian border is still closed. It has been now for over a year. Air travel to many, many countries is still severely limited or blocked. And this has a big impact on an economy that is somewhat designed to be interconnected, right? And so there's this concept of the division of labor, right? Which is just this idea that different people in a society do different tasks, right? You have a doctor, you have carpenter, you have a welder, you have a mechanic, you have a professor, right? We all kind of do different jobs. Well, on the global level, we have what's called the international division of labor, which is that different countries tend to specialize in different economic tasks. Brazil and Florida make the oranges. We'll let the Swiss make the chocolate, the coffee from Colombia and Indonesia and a few other places, right? The cars will be made, in particular, places. It used to be Detroit and, Yokohama and those sort of areas, and now it's kind of shifted a little bit. But there are different parts of the world that specialize in different things. And what this means is that the supply chains that kind of the global economy depends on are international, right? When the pandemic began and people were trying to figure out how do they continue sourcing some of their materials, some companies actually had a very difficult time figuring out just where all of their stuff came from because they were working through subcontractors who worked through subcontractors. And when, like, initially COVID was hitting China and they were trying to figure out how to find alternative suppliers for some of their things in their supply chains, sometimes they couldn't, it was very complicated to figure out exactly where everything was coming from. But as some of the movement restrictions around COVID happened, it really kind of disrupted a lot of these interconnections, right? And one of the reasons why the global economy is so interconnected is because of the concept of comparative advantage. And essentially what this means is that different parts of the world focusing on producing different commodities because they're better suited for it, right? They can do it more efficiently, more cost effectively, and therefore they concentrate on those things. And so because of that, we have a really high level of kind of spatial specialization in economic tasks. The problem, of course, is when the linkages break, and then all of a sudden you can't find toilet paper, right, or other sort of things. And then even within countries, when the pandemic started, there was a huge problem where all the restaurants closed down, and then the farmers that supplied restaurants had all of this food that they would normally give to sell to restaurants, and that product was no longer needed, but it had been grown in the fields, and they couldn't kind of adjust their supply chains fast enough to then ship those to the grocery stores whose business was booming because nobody was going out to restaurants. And it created this whole disruption in sort of these supply chains. And we still see some of that even today in 2021 for sure, but it was kind of a little more of a shock at the beginning of the process. And so, of course, one of the things that happened then throughout the pandemic is you had these economic sort of downturns. You had days where the stock market really dropped a lot. Some of this is sort of rebounded. But as I'm going to argue here, it's been a little bit precarious in terms of the way in which the economy is sort of coming out of this time period. And this kind of leads to this next subject, which is the idea of kind of economic instability and the possibility of sort of a economic collapse. Because most people are aware that throughout history, the global economy has experienced booms and busts, right? Most people know about the Great Depression. We talk about the downturn in 2008 with the collapse of the US housing market. There's been others, global panics and depressions over the last several hundred years. And what I want to look at here is a little bit not just that these crashes occur, but why. And also then why we're in a little bit of a precarious position as we speak. Okay. So one of the things that we're going to focus on here is this idea of crisis, right? And that a lot of what goes on in the global economy has to do with ways in which firms and national economies are trying to avoid crises or to take the consequences of sort of an economic crisis or an economic contradiction and kind of kick it down the road and not let it sort of collapse the whole system. And I'll get to what I mean a little more specifically about this idea of crisis and how we try to overcome it. But also, why the position we're in today is kind of precarious, because not just because the economy itself is somewhat precarious, but also because the things we've done in the past to try to fix crises actually make it more precarious in the long term, and I'll get to that. So in 2008, when the last kind of major economic downturn in the United States and globally, really, in 2008, there's this guy, Jim Cramer, Mad Money, does like a show on, I think, CNBC. But he's, stock market guy or whatever, certainly not a radical dude. And one of the things, somebody was asking him was like, trying to figure out why this collapse happened. And he said, somebody asked him, do you believe we will look back on the financial innovations of the last several decades with regrets? And he said, well, and he's talking about some of the things that were in that video, Inside Job, that I'm also kind of assigning for this module. I'll talk more about that in a second. But what Jim Cramer said, these new innovations, these new financial kind of, innovations that were developed in the early 2000s, so they almost brought our country down. The only guy who really called this right was Karl Marx. Marx understood what would happen if you let the market run amok. They brought our nation to its knees, and we're not going to end up being a great power because of what happened. And he's talking about the United States. That this was really a huge kind of blow to not just the economic power, but even the political power of the United States kind of when it happened. And that may seem overblown, but we'll keep going here. And so one of the things that we have to mention here is that, okay, so Jim Cramer, this very, kind of pro-capitalist guy, is bringing up Marx. Why? Well, we have to understand a couple things about the political philosophy of Karl Marx. I mean, he's mostly known for his advocacy of communism and the way in which, his philosophies have been celebrated by communist parties and other kinds of liberation movements, throughout the 20th century. However, in what I'm going to talk about today, we have to look at another aspect of his political, about his academic research, which is that Marx may be well known for his advocacy of communism, but what most of his work was really about was trying to analyze how does capitalism function. And so that's kind of where we're going to be at here in this module. And so kind of try and separate out a little bit sort of what you may think about Karl Marx and his advocacy for kind of, communist, economics, and think more about the fact that what we're going to talk about here today is some of his analysis of the way capitalism functions. You have to remember his major work, Das Kapital, right, is about capital. It's not about communism. And so that's where we're kind of going here. And one of the things he argued, as you can see here, accumulation of wealth at one pole is at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, and mental degradation at the opposite pole. I mean, we talked about this a little bit in the population dynamics section. Marx was somebody who definitely looked at the current capitalist economy as sort of a, what's the right word? A system of sort of inequality that is strengthened inequality, that sort of kept the rich kept richer and the poor kept getting poorer, and that was sort of an unfair system. And so we have to kind of look at why he sort of thought that. But more importantly, we want to look at the ideas of why this makes the global economy actually somewhat unstable and prone to a potential collapse. Okay, so some of this was, kind of touched on in the video on Inside Job about the 2008 economic crisis and the way in which kind of these different investment models were unstable and how prices of the housing market, when they started going down, kind of caused this whole kind of finance economy to sort of start to unravel. However, one of the ways that kind of saved the day was that the United States government and other governments pumped tons and tons of money into saving those financial institutions. And we're going to come back to that here a little bit. I would argue that what is potentially coming is much worse than 2008. And we have to kind of look at why. Okay. So I'm actually going to skip over some of the stuff on biopower here. If you remember, when we talked about zombies, we talked about biopower, right? This idea that you need a productive population, right, to sort of compete with international rivals and to have a healthy economy, right? Well, some of this kind of comes up in the pandemic when, during the Trump administration, there was this idea that, yes, COVID was bad as a health problem, but that actually a bigger problem was like not keeping people in kind of productive economic activities, right? That, some of the things that Trump would say was like, well, we can't let the cure be worse than the problem. And he wants the country opened up by Easter, I think that was Easter 2020, maybe. Yeah. Anyway, that clearly didn't happen. But there was this idea that the economic consequences of not kind of being in production was worse than COVID. And so and then once COVID started to abate, we now have different sort of economic issues, which is, for instance, more inflation, the housing market going really high, these sort of things. But there's these other kind of instabilities lurking out there. But some of this comes back to this idea of biopolitics, which is, if you remember, it's not just about keeping your population safe, it's about keeping your population productive. And the COVID pandemic was actually a problem because there's two sort of logics that the government was trying to follow. One, keep your population healthy. One, keep them productive and producing. And you couldn't kind of do both of them at the same time. And so there was all sorts of conflicts across the political spectrum over how to handle that contradiction. And we're still seeing that today. Okay. Boop, boop, boop. All right. So with that background, let's take a look at capitalism, how it works, and why it's unstable. Okay. So the first part here that I have to talk about is the way in which economies function. And there's some acronyms or letters here that stand for things I'm going to put out there. The first is the idea that economies back in the day functioned through what we call CC, or commodity to commodity exchange. And here's what I mean by that. You can think of some time thousands of years ago before there was money, and the way people exchanged things were like, I have chickens and I got eggs, and I would like some lumber, so I go to the person that has some lumber and I say, hey, here's some eggs. Can we change my commodity for your commodity, right? There's no money, so we're just going to trade and barter. And that was sort of the beginning of an economy, in a sense, right? An economy as sort of a way of distributing goods or services around through any particular society. But the problem with CC as a way of organizing your economy is that it's slow, it's messy, and it's not terribly efficient. So for instance, what if the guy who has lumber doesn't want any eggs that day? Well, crap, I just can't do anything. Well, let's see, maybe I can change the eggs for somebody who has corn, and then maybe I can trade that corn to the person with lumber, right? But that starts getting complicated. So then a lot of societies start developing money as a means of exchange, a way of going from one commodity to another. And I should back up a second and just mention, when I'm using the term commodity, essentially it's anything that can be bought or sold, right? So money takes this place as the means of exchange, meaning I have eggs, I go and say, hey, who wants an egg? It's $1. They give me $1. Then I can go take that dollar and I can go get I can go get lumber, or I can go get corn, or go get whatever. And the person who has corn doesn't have to need eggs that day, or vice versa. You can see how this kind of really opens up how an economy functions when you have an easy to carry means of exchange that's universal that I can kind of give to everybody. But here's where things get interesting in terms of the capitalist economy. People figured out that we could kind of flip this around. Instead of it being commodity, turn it into money, and then get another commodity, we could take money, produce some sort of commodity, and then sell it for more money, right? And so this is kind of flipping the order of which the economy sort of functioned. And here we come to kind of, yes, I'm actually going to try to explain the modern global capitalist economy in one slide. All right. So we get this thing called MCM prime. And the reason it's M prime is it means more money. At the end of this process, you want more than you started with. There's two sort of sections here on how this economy functions. And again, the reason we have to get into the weeds here a little bit is that it will make much more sense as to then why we have economic instability, potentially kind of apocalyptic levels of economic instability. So bear with me here on this. So MCM, the first part of this is about producing a commodity. You're taking money and you're making something. And the key point here in the capitalist economy is that you are not just buying something, you are producing something. And I'll show you why this is important, right? It's not just, I buy low price and sell at a high price. People do that, and that's sometimes referred to as like mercantilism or other sorts of kind of ways of doing economy. Capitalism is a little different. You produce a commodity, and I'll explain why. The second part of this is selling your commodity, right? Consumption. So you got to make something and then you got to sell it. And obviously you want to sell it for more than you make it. And this might seem basic, but there's some weird stuff going on here. Let me explain. So let's say to start a commodity, to start producing a commodity, you need some money to do this process, right? You need money for raw materials. You need to have a factory or equipment or that kind of stuff. And you also need money to pay the workers who are going to produce this. And so let's say hypothetically, we are making, I always pick something random around my office. We're making cups. All right. So in our cup factory, we have to get the ceramics, we have to get some paints and glazes and that sort of thing. And we have to get the clay, I guess, right, to make this thing. So, and let's say that we can make a batch of cups and it's going to cost us $100. And then we sell it for $200, right? Good business. We wouldn't do it if we couldn't make more than we started with. We wouldn't be doing this in the first place. All right. But here's an interesting thing. And this is where not just Marx, but earlier economists, Ricardo and others were kind of like, hey, you added value to this product. Where did it come from? Is this somewhat sort of, in a sense, in terms of the math, somewhat magical? You took $100 and you turned it into $200. How did you do that? Because a lot of these early economists, going all the way back to Adam Smith and John Locke and others, had this idea that the only place that value comes from is through human labor. In other words, if something is worth something, has value economically, it's because somebody expended labor on it. So like a tree that fell down in the woods somewhere, in a sense, doesn't have economic value. It's free. I could walk up there and just pick it up and do whatever to it, right? However, if I want a chair made out of wood, what I'm paying for is not the tree itself that just fell down in the woods. What I'm paying for is somebody went out there, grabbed the tree, took it back home, cut it into pieces, fashioned it into a chair. And the reason I have to pay money for this is because I'm paying for their labor. Somebody had to work on this, and they needed money so that they could stay alive in order to make chairs, right? And so without this kind of expenditure of labor, there is, in a sense, no economic value. So that's kind of a fairly kind of common level of, kind of economic thought, this idea that labor is what creates value. So the question is, how did we get extra value, or what we call surplus value? Well, you had these people down here doing the workers. Evidently, it's 1870, and we have children in our factories. But here's what's interesting, is that you have this extra $100 that's been created in this process. And remember, you've already paid for labor here, right? You've paid $30 for labor. So where did this extra money come from? And this is where kind of Karl Marx had his philosophy on this. He said, you know what? These people got exploited. He'd say, what his argument was this. He said, these people actually they took these raw materials and the factory equipment, which was $70 for the batch of stuff we're making, and they actually added $130 of value to that product, right? By making the cups, by taking the clay and turning them into cups and firing and glazing and doing all the work that they did. And so you then had a $200 of value in our set of cups that we just made, but you only paid them $30. And in other words, that extra $100 is essentially just not being given to the people who made it. And instead, it belongs to, let's say it's us, say we're the owners of this factory, it's us. We get that extra value. And what's interesting is this idea of who does that extra, what's called surplus value belong to, is a huge political issue, right? Because under like Marxist philosophies and some other philosophies, the people down here should be splitting that money. But under capitalism, they're like, no, this belongs to whoever sort of organized the production, right? The owner of that particular factory. And so what Marx kind of argues is that this system sets up a class society. And what he means by that is not just lower class and upper class or rich people and poor people. What he means is that they have different relationships to this whole system of production that's going on here. You have people who are working, being paid by the hour, and then you have some people who are making money through ownership, through organizing the means of production, and then taking that extra value. And so these two different classes, the owners and the working class, is not rich and poor per se. It's two different ways of making money. And if you think about it, there are still basically two ways of making money in today's society. You can go to work and get paid per hour, or you could be the owner of something and somebody pays you money for access to what you own. So for instance, If I was a landlord, I'm not, but if I was, I could get somebody to pay me rent every month. And because I'm an owner, I just make money like that. I don't necessarily have to, quote, go to work or be paid by the hour for this. Also, if I was the owner of a bunch of stocks or the owner of a company, etc., I would accrue money from owning that and getting the surplus value of whatever's being produced. However, even though I have a job that I like and is relatively well paying, I still do have to show up, and get and do labor to end up getting paid, right? Because I am not really, in a sense, an owner of anything. I'm still a laborer who has to come in and spend time making lectures, grading things, meeting with people and students, and coming up with curriculum and all the kind of things I do. It doesn't have to be manual labor. Another good example here would be like LeBron James. LeBron James makes tens of millions of dollars a year, but he still has to actually show up and play basketball, right, to get paid that. He's not the owner of the Lakers, right? He works for the Lakers. I guarantee you that the owners of the Lakers make more money from having LeBron James on the team in terms of ticket sales and jersey sales and concessions and blah, 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 and television revenue. They make more money off of him being on the team than LeBron James gets paid in salary, even though he gets paid millions of dollars. So you can still be a rich worker. You could also be a failure as an owner and go broke. So the point is not rich and poor. The point is there are two different classes and ways of making money. But here's a problem. So here, surplus value goes to this person. And let's say that this person then has to pay some taxes, but they have this $200 that they got, and they have to go to taxes. And let's say the owner takes $50 to use for whatever they feel like using. And then if they take $100 of that and throw it back into production, right, buy more raw materials, more tools, more labor to make another batch, they just keep doing this over and over again. And every time a new batch of cups sells, cha-ching, they get their $50 that they can spend on whatever, right? They're amassing money. When we talk about this reinvested surplus value, that's what is called capital, right? That's where the term capitalism comes from. You're reinvesting your surplus value, and it keeps going round and round, and you just kind of make money as this process goes on. Okay. So why is this unstable, though? Okay. A few reasons. One is that you have some people with different relationships to this process, right? And I've mentioned it's not just rich and poor. There's two fundamental ways to make money, and some people, aren't really big on the fact that they know that they're sort of being exploited. The other thing too is that, and I'll explain this here in a second, capitalism needs and intensifies inequality. Let me explain. There is something called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is a little bit complicated, but essentially it goes something like this. Let me go back to my... Every time you do this process, it becomes a little less profitable. You've already sold some cups, you got a few less customers. It makes it a little harder to continue doing this time after time after time. And remember this whole point that there's two different parts to this, producing a commodity, selling a commodity. Okay, this becomes important because who's buying our cups? By and large, well, it's workers, right, within the society. If you're the owner, you have this impetus to pay these people as little as possible. However, the problem is these people are also your customers, right? When we're talking about it sort of society-wide. So businesses are trying to keep wages low to pay them, but you also want people to buy stuff and have money in their pockets to do so. This is actually a contradiction and starts becoming a problem because if you actually look back at why we have economic downturns, things like the Great Depression, they don't happen because there's not enough stuff in the world, right? The Great Depression was not a problem of we couldn't produce enough commodities. The Great Depression happened because of a failure to be able to sell enough commodities. It's what they call a crisis of overproduction. And what that means is that society-wide, we made a bunch of cars, and the thing about the 1920s, right, with the Great Depression, we made a bunch of cars, there was houses, there was other kinds of commercial goods, and people basically couldn't buy it all. You ran out of the ability to sort of sell all of this and realize your profits. And when people started realizing that this was a problem, well, you can extend, there's a few different ways to sort of get out of that contradiction that your producers are also that your workers are also your consumers. There's a few ways to try and get out of this. And let me explain this. Okay. Okay. So there's a few ways you can do this. If you don't have enough customers and your economy is sort of falling down, one thing you can do is stimulus packages, right? The government can basically flush money into the system, into people's pockets. And we had that during the COVID pandemic, right? On a couple of occasions, the government said, you know what? The economy is in deep trouble. People can't buy things. There's not enough demand out there. And businesses are starting to kind of fail. Well, let's put money in their pocket from tax money, or really kind of government debt, and give it to people, and that will stimulate the economy. And we've done this a few times, and we also did it in 2008 here in the United States. And this is very much an idea that goes back to a Keynesian philosophy, Keynes being a British economist. It's like public spending will kind of help keep the economy moving. And this also happened in like the New Deal after the Great Depression to sort of get things moving. So Milton Keynes was the economist, and he says increase effective demand. And what effective demand means is demand is people wanting to buy in our cups. Effective demand is also having money in our pockets, so that are people having money in their pockets to buy our cups, right? So Keynes said increase effective demand, it'll kind of make production ramp up again, and the government should spend money when times are bad and then kind of save money when times are good. Okay. But the problem is that this didn't work forever. It worked in the 1930s and 40s, 50s, 60s, and then it kind of stopped working. And this is important because there was then a couple of ideas for, well, okay, if you've got this crisis sort of at the heart of the system, which is that your workers are your consumers and you have to sell them things, but there's not enough money, there's a few things you can do. Well, you can stop investing in social programs, infrastructure, education, public works. In other words, sort of strip mine your future productive capacity to have liquid cash now. And what I mean by this is that there's a whole kind of train of thought called neoliberalism, which was this idea that cut government spending, cut taxes. If you remember the diagram there of MCM, where you had the owner and part of their money was going for taxes, slash their taxes so that they'll put more money back in the system, and also so that owners will buy more stuff and become consumers. But it comes at a cost, right? Because you're slashing healthcare, you're slashing social programs, you're slashing education. And this happened in the United States from the 1970s sort of onward. A great example of this is, how much did you pay for tuition? Well, I kind of know because I have a girl who's going into college next year, and I know how much people are paying for tuition. When I went to school, my tuition was $600 a semester. Why? Not because they started paying professors a lot more in the last 20 years, but because states stopped using tax money to fund education as well as they used to. I worked with a guy in Hawaii who in the 1970s went to college in California at UC Berkeley. His school was free because he was a California resident, and if you graduated high school and had good grades and got into Cal Berkeley, you didn't pay anything. And so there's been this move away from thinking of education or healthcare or social programs as sort of social goods, and instead thinking them as sort of individual benefits that you get to pay for. And that's one reason that they were able to, that sort of the structural crisis in the economy was able to be sort of kicked down the road, less taxes, let the owners kind of keep that money as more effective demand. But it comes at a cost, and it doesn't work forever. So there's a couple other ways you can try to get out of this. One is called the temporal fix. The temporal fix means selling your stuff more frequently. If we only sold one thing of cups to people, we had to be like, you know what? Now we don't just have mugs that you can use for coffee. We have cups to use for dinner. And you should now buy 2 sets of cups when you used to only buy 1, right? You try to squeeze your customers more and more. The problem is, as you can probably figure out, is that may save your firm, our cup producing company. But if every company in the country is trying to do that, there's only so far you can go, because you can't all squeeze the same customers harder and harder because they just only have a finite amount of money. The other thing you can do is something called just-in-time manufacturing, which means you don't make stuff until it's already been ordered, so that you don't produce more than you can sell. And that's, still, though, to make profits, you got to make and sell stuff. And so this doesn't totally save you. It just makes you a little more efficient. But this is something that lots of companies have done over the last like 20, 30 years. But here's the big one that you can do. If you've got this contradiction in your system, people can't afford to buy stuff, but you can't raise their wages either, right? Because they're your producers. You can give them credit cards. You can give them student loans. You can give them government stimulus things that are paid with debt money, essentially, right? And I'm going to get into that a little bit more here in a second. But the other last one is what they call the spatial fix. You can go find new customers somewhere. Hey, we sold cups around New England. Now we're going to sell them to Canada and to the South United States. And then we're going to sell them in Europe. And then we're going to sell them in Latin America and in China. And we're going to just keep increasing our market. Oh, and we might move our production facilities and get cheaper labor in China, first Mexico, and then maybe China, and then Cambodia, right? But the problem with the spatial fix is that you can also see where this ends at some point, right? So after the Cold War ends, Russia and Eastern Europe gets integrated into the global economy, and there's a bunch more customers for Western businesses. Then China joins the WTO in the 2000s, and all of a sudden there's a bigger market, and also cheap labor becomes more available. But at this stage of the game, what country are you going to go sell stuff to? What country has not been opened? Also, in terms of cheap labor, now that you've gone from the United States to Mexico to China to Cambodia or wherever with your factory, where are you going to find even cheaper labor? So to many people, that contradiction, that way of overcoming the contradiction in the economy is sort of coming to an end. But that spatial fix is really important for thinking about why we have globalization in the first place. It's a way to sort of escape one of the contradictions, right? It's a way to keep trying to make money in this system that relies on inequality by kind of continually finding new markets and new labor. Okay. So neoliberalism, I talked a little bit about that, which is kind of the strip mining of different programs. But debt is really huge. Because, where's my debt picture? Where's my debt? Okay. Well, the amount of debt that exists in the world now is astounding. So, for instance, the global gross domestic product, which is the amount of all the value of all the goods and services produced in the world in 2017 was about $80 trillion. Right now, actually 2018, it's definitely gone up since then, there was $237 trillion in debt. In other words, when people's wages weren't rising in the 1970s, but you still needed to sell them stuff, you started giving them student loans, long-term mortgages, and credit cards. And that kept the system going. And then you have to remember, it's not about you as a consumer and keeping you happy, although that's part of it. It's about for owners being able to continue to sell things without paying more in wages. And the way you do that is by introducing debt. The problem is that, of course, is this ever going to be paid off? How do you pay off on a global level a debt that you'd actually have to have every single person in the world work for free for 3 years in order to pay it off? It's never getting paid off. If you have a gigantic pile of student loans, like I do, everyone's not paying these off. That's not realistic. It's not economically possible for the American workforce to pay off the trillions of dollars in loans that people had to take out to go to school. We're also not paying off all of our credit cards either, right? This is not just a personal problem or financial or moral failure. It's a societal, economic, structural problem, right? So then this is why in like the videos from 2008, there was such a panic, is that what happened is the debt market started freezing up. People started being like, oh my gosh, the people who held debt started worrying that they were ever going to get paid back because the value of the houses and things that they were holding as collateral on the debts, when the value of those started going down, people started being like, oh my God, I'm not convinced I'm ever going to get my money back here. I'm not going to give out more loans, and I want to get money. And this is one of the reasons why whenever there is a economic downturn, usually it shows up first as a credit crisis, which sounds weird because the problem actually isn't with credit. The problem is that you're not continuing to extend more and more and more credit so that people can buy stuff that's been produced. And the reason you need that is you can't realize profits without it. As you can see, this system is honestly a little bit, from when you think about it in the long term, insane. And definitely unstable. And then we also have to think of the environmental consequences of this. The only way the system stays, functional is by continually producing more and more things, selling to more customers and selling to them more often and giving them debt to buy more things. And of course, all these things are initially coming from the natural world. And so it's this incredible kind of, there's this incredible need, economic need, to continually produce more and more intensively. And the economic or the environmental consequences of that are pretty evident all around us, right? Okay. So one of the things is that now that we're looking at what's happened during the COVID pandemic is the ability to kind of do the spatial fix and globalize and rely on global markets has been certainly a problem. People have just pumped more debt into the system. And we have, a lot less kind of interconnectivity and this sort of things. And the question is that how long can we kind of, I don't know, I guess the question is A, what are the economic consequences of the fact that we kind of lost these years in terms of economic productivity and relied on essentially extending more debt and credit to kind of keep the economy afloat? Oops. Evidently, I just have that too many times. Okay. Because one of the things here is that none of these techniques work without effective demand. People have to be able to buy stuff. And so the question is that now that the pandemic is sort of hopefully starting to, again, wind down in the United States, but not globally, what are the questions in terms of how, the economic imperatives here say that we should probably start to try to become more, should we after this try to relink to other parts of the global economy again, or should nations start to try and make their economies a little more insulated so that we don't have this kind of shock again in the future? The problem is that then you don't have the spatial fix and the ability to sort of overcome crises that way. But really, a lot of this comes down to two, is like, are we going to sort of delink in a larger sense, from the global economy? Or will we see the world and its people as fundamentally interconnected and realize that, hey, we got to manage global problems in more cooperative ways, right? Are we going to still kind of keep a global mindset and realize that, the problems that happened with COVID and the economic downturns are kind of more global problems? But this really comes down to sort of an ethical choice, is when we see things like disease, poverty, environmental hazards, discriminations, oppressions, and even like, poverty and those sort of things, do we think of those as their problem or our problem, right? Do we sort of include, when we're seeing those sort of things on the international scene or even in other parts of our own country, does this seem like a collective problem we have to deal with, or do we kind of push it off and say, well, that's just something we should insulate ourselves from, right? And then this is kind of comes full circle here, is, or do we turn to sort of apocalyptic visions promising fundamental or violent change? In other words, we see these contradictions, we see these problems, we see a very complex world that seems to be somewhat spinning out of control. Well, as we know from earlier in the semester, one of the ways that people seek control is in apocalyptic visions. Because if you recall, especially in like the Judeo-Christian, and Islam and many other faiths as well, this idea of the apocalypse is to have a better world afterwards, right? It's a way of dealing with the messiness of what's going on in the world and to kind of crave a more simple and pious and moral sort of existence by having God or some other sort of massive force come through and just kill everybody else off and just make it all a little bit less complicated, right? And you definitely see this over history, right? Goes back to when Revelation was written, but and even before, some of the stories from Zoroastrianism and others that kind of precede that, but also throughout U.S. history. And you get things like the Millerites in 1843, who are convinced that the end of the world was coming and sort of were sitting there, kind of waiting for this. And then you get other sort of apocalyptic cults like Heaven's Gate, who thought that the spaceship that was going to take them away was hiding behind a comet. This happened like 20 years ago or so. So they all killed themselves and put on their Nikes and killed themselves and wrapped themselves in purple sheets, waiting to be picked up so that their spirits can be picked up by UFOs behind the comets. All right. Yep, it gets crazy. But apocalyptic kind of stuff is not just religious. It also seeps into sort of secular politics. And so, for instance, you have things like QAnon that are very much have this apocalyptic vision of like the storm is coming, right? Or the Boogaloo Boys, this idea that there's going to be this sort of, this civil war or race war in the United States, and that there's going to be sort of a reckoning, and, the people on the other side of the political spectrum are just going to be sort of swept away. And it's not just the right that does this, right? This is also political philosophy on the left, right? The whole ideas around some of the revolutionary ideologies, like some of the things from Marxism that I mentioned before, or like with Lenin in the Soviet Union, or Mao in China, or Pol Pot in Cambodia. There was this idea on sort of the political left that you have a revolution, and it's the same thing, sort of an apocalypse. You sweep clean the existing corrupt social structures, and you put in something new that is utopian, right? Where the virtuous, in this case, sort of the workers, are saved. But in both cases, is this kind of idea that you're going to wipe everybody out, right? And then, of course, there is also another kind of apocalypticism in liberal circles today around, for instance, like environmental issues, climate change, that sort of thing. Like if we don't change what we're doing in kind of our immoral environmental ways, the calamity is coming and the end of the world is near. And so, and I'm not, again, not trying to sort of judge, or what's the right word, say that the philosophical or moral bases of all these things are all the same, but what they do share in common is that belief of sort of like things are corrupt, they're complicated, they're not going the right way, and we need sort of like a storm, needs to come to sort of to right things, because the problems are big and we need fundamental, complete and total change. Okay. All right. There's all my QAnon stuff. Right. So in that case, secular apocalypticism, it functions as a critique. If you don't change your behavior or political life, we'll all burn. But also a hope for a cleansing force that brings the New Jerusalem. And what I think is so fascinating is just how prevalent this kind of idea is across the political spectrum, left, right, and center. Right. And I just mentioned all these. But what I think is going to be interesting, and this is, where the next module goes. And I know this module was long, but there's a lot going on here, let's face it. The next module is short, and it's the last one. And what we're going to look at there is, what if the apocalypse isn't coming? What if life isn't going to get more simple? What if the problems that we're dealing with today are actually the problems we're going to deal with tomorrow? What if the economic system isn't going to be saved by the next stimulus package or the next credit card we get in the mail or whatever? Like maybe there's some fundamental problems we actually are going to have to deal with at some point, right? And also, importantly, what if every day we have to kind of wake up and deal with the things as they are? And yes, there's going to be crises, and there's going to be hazards, and there's going to be some death and destruction, and there's going to be some good days too. But some people find it very depressing that what may be in our future is fairly similar to what is in our present. But we're going to kind of grapple with that in the last module. All right, I've held you here long enough. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next module.